Good evening, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. This weekend, the Ontario Liberals are voting for a new leader, and even though I have been an active Liberal for most of my life, as some of you can imagine, I'm feeling a little divorced from this current leadership campaign. But I thought, while I am never going to express a point of view on who people should vote for, I thought I would take this opportunity to give you what my platform would be if I was running, and what I think Ontario desperately needs to reinvent its future. I've got a 10-point plan, and I think they break down as follows. First of all, I think we need a vision for Toronto and Ontario. Second of all, we have a housing crisis. Third of all, I think we need transit because we've got a congestion crisis. Fourth, we have a debt and deficit crisis in Ontario and in our cities around Ontario. We've got a productivity and prosperity crisis, a critical minerals and ring of fire need that if we don't invest, we'll have a crisis. We have a long-term care crisis. We have a healthcare crisis. I strongly believe we have a governance crisis. And I think that we have a crisis of confidence in who Canada is and our federal system. So I want to go through each one of these in a little bit more detail and tell you what I think needs to get done. Toronto right now is the third largest metropolitan area in all of North America. I don't think we realize that. It stretches from Oshawa to Kitchener-Waterloo and to Niagara. And when you compare that continuous urban area to Los Angeles, to New York, we aren't as big as them, but we're bigger than Chicago, Houston, Dallas, all of the other contenders. Fourth in North America after, if you include Mexico City. This is the economic engine of Canada, as important to Ontario and Canada as oil and gas is to Alberta and Canada. And I don't think that we have that attitude. We don't have that vision. We're fragmented. We're balkanized. We're not thinking about this incredible, wonderful place we call home and how it could and should be the economic engine. And I'm not neglecting the balance of Ontario, but I think that we've got to focus in on the Greater Toronto Area because it really is the majority of the population of Ontario, a very significant portion of the population of Canada, and a very significant part of the economic activity within Canada. And if we don't manage it right, if we don't govern it right, if we don't support it right, then I don't think we're going to grow the way that we need to. I don't think we're going to have the prosperity that we need to. We're not going to create the taxes that we need that's going to fund and support all of our other crises. And I think we need someone that is going to show a vision and get us all excited about this vision for this economic engine that is the Greater Toronto Area and how it all is connected together. And we need a whole bunch of other things like transit and highways and the planning to connect it. The second thing that I want to talk about is the housing crisis. And I think this is the crisis of our generation, because I think our generation is the first generation that is going to regrettably, very regrettably, leave the next generation in a worse off situation than every generation previously has left the following generation. I think every generation previously has left the future generation a more positive future. But because of a couple of things, what we're doing is we are taking economic opportunities away from our children and our grandchildren, and we're using them up ourselves. Part of that is because this baby boom is such a sizable portion of the population. But I think a lot of it is because, number one, we've created debt deficits that are outrageous from a historical concept and context. And the only way to deal with that is by increasing taxes in the future and or inflating out of it by depreciating the value of historical debt by massive inflation in the future, which clearly we can't have. But more importantly, because I think we have created this affordability crisis, and the affordability crisis, I think, is primarily because of the lack of supply of housing. And I think the lack of supply of housing is primarily because of government. Government has created the problem, and it's primarily local government that has created the problem. And I think that we should be looking at local government and saying, what the blank? have you done and are you doing? We haven't seen the future. We are producing in Ontario today as many houses, as many housing units as we did in the 1970s when our population has doubled. We should be producing a lot more. Single family homes are about the same. They should have doubled. Condos have increased dramatically. What has declined dramatically is rental stock and rental housing and purpose-built rental. And why is because of government policies, tax structures, rental controls, restrictions that have made it very impossible until just recently to profitably build and rent out apartments. And that's got to change. It has got to change, particularly with very expensive housing, which is not going to be solved right away. How are people going to live if they can't rent? And we need to have that rental housing. I think there's a couple of things that we need to do and we need to do quickly. The first thing is we need to build density and improve height around major transit areas. We've talked about these major transit areas for a while now. You may have noticed in BC, in the Lower Mainland, they've enacted a policy where rather than maximum heights, they're applying minimum heights of, I think it's 20 stories, and ensuring that people build height. And it makes sense because we're building those transit lines and those transit stations so that people can get on them and commute. And the people that we want to get on them and commute are the people that don't necessarily have to therefore own cars. And therefore, they're going to have to walk to the stations. And so therefore, they should and have to probably live close to those stations. I had Jennifer Keesmet, the former chief planner for the city of Toronto, on my show at one point in time. And she said one of the biggest mistakes we made when we did the Bloor-Danforth line is we didn't increase zoning at the major transit stations. And you can see that along Yonge Street at Yonge and St. Clair, at Yonge and Eglinton, at Yonge and Shepherd. We have density, we have height, and in the future we'll have more. But along the Bloor-Danforth line, we don't, and we should at High Park, at Keele, at Runnymede, go through the whole list, and in the Danforth, Pape, etc. We should approve density along those lines. And I think that density should be 50% more, if not twice as much as is currently zoned. I've talked to a bunch of architects that say above 5-7 stories, people don't notice height. They just don't notice it because they're, on the street and they're looking around. And so all these politicians and neighborhood, people that oppose development always talk about height. And I don't know why it's become this political thing, but height is the easiest solution to our housing problem. Because if you've got 20 stories or 30 stories and you increase it to 40 or 50 stories, those extra floors can come in pretty cheap and provide a heck of a lot of housing for the future. I think we need a dramatic increase in density along major arterials. Lots of people have taken a look at Kingston Road and Dundas and Bloor and Eglinton and 1- and 2-story strip plazas that populate most of those streets, and have called them, I think, justifiably, some of the worst planning, some of the worst development that has ever taken place. But it doesn't make economic sense to go in and buy those plazas that are 1 or 2 stories if all you're going to get is 3 or 4 stories. You need to have increased density. And if you take a look at major arterials, in London, England, in Paris, France, in a lot of the Western world, they would have 6 or 8 stories as a minimum. And I don't think there's any reason why we can't have that. And when I go to Paris and you've got beautiful retail and restaurants on the main floor and then residential above it, it's wonderful. I think there's a real opportunity to increase density along major arterials. And then I do think that this policy that's been put in place of late that allows people as of right with single family homes to increase the size of their homes to either a triplex or a quadplex, I think that makes sense. I just don't think a lot of people are going to do it. And so I'm worried that it's good politics, but it's not actually good policy. And so I do think that the other answers are the more important answers to get the increased housing that we so desperately need. And I'm, a numbers guy and an economist kind of guy. And so I do believe in supply and demand. And I think because we've kept supply down and demand has increased, pricing has gone up. And so I think if we have a dramatic increase in supply, pricing will stabilize, if not come down. And I think that as I mentioned, government, primarily local government, that has been giving in to NIMBYism has been the major source of that mistake. And I'm not suggesting for a nanosecond that we have towers everywhere. I think 85, 90% of Toronto and the suburbs around Toronto are going to stay single family homes. All I'm talking about is around major transit areas and on major arterials. And that's where I think we need development. I think that we need to have a 50% reduction in red tape and approval times. Build and StatsCan and CMHC have done analyses that have said that we have the longest approval times in the Western world. And in Canada, it's Toronto and Victoria that have the worst and longest approval times. Mississauga rivals that. And I'm not sure that long approval time does any good other than discourage development because it takes longer and time is money. I don't know if we have confidence that we're actually building better developments because of that time period. In fact, I'm convinced it doesn't add value. I'm not suggesting that we let people build whatever they want to build. I still think that planning departments and zoning and communities and the Ontario Land Tribunal or whatever should have the role that they review developments, but they don't have to take 3 years to do it. It can be done far more quickly, and there doesn't have to be as many departments involved. I was at an event just this week for Housing Week. Olivia Chow was the speaker, and I spoke with a developer afterwards who said that development in Toronto right now, in the Greater Toronto Area, in Southern Ontario, is paralyzed because of red tape, high interest rates, high construction costs, high pricing, and scared consumers. And the red tape is one of the biggest reasons. And that we've got too many city planning departments that may want to try to increase housing, but they're hampered by the red tape of too many departments, too many people that get involved all along the way in the development approvals. Provincial taxes on rental housing should be eliminated, just like the GST was for federal, from a federal standpoint on rental housing. I think that we dramatically need to increase our rental housing development. Development fees have been a big argument. I do think they are a tax on some of the least advantaged in our society. I think originally there was some justification that new development should pay for its way for infrastructure and things like that. But I think that we know that our society is growing, and we're growing our society based on immigration and wanting to have young people be able to own homes and buy homes because it's good for us. It's good for society. And to tax those people that are the least advantaged because they've just moved to Canada or because they're young and they're just buying their first condominium or their first house with outrageously high development fees that I think are dramatically more than the development infrastructure costs that are actually caused by this new development, I think is wrong. And I think it's been not a slush fund, but close to a slush fund by a lot of cities where they've jacked up these development fees. They're very different in different communities, which I think goes to suggest that they're inappropriately charged. And they're the opposite of a progressive income tax system that I firmly believe in, because it is a tax on renters that want to become homeowners, on young people that want to become homeowners, on immigrants that move to the country and want to become homeowners. It is the worst kind of regressive tax. All of society should be paying for those costs of infrastructure because we do know we're going to grow and we need to grow. And so why those development fees have become so expensive such that, you know, I've heard numbers like $140,000 on every home from development fees. It's just wrong. And you don't have just development fees. You've got demands for public art and for public space and for parkland and it goes on and on. We are taxing new development when we should be incentivizing new development. I think that public-private partnerships are key to build affordable housing. I mentioned that I was at this presentation by Olivia Chow, the new mayor of Toronto, and she talked about public-private partnerships. She's got, and I think lots of people have very ambitious plans for affordable housing and the increase in it. City governments can't get into the development business themselves to that extent and build the kind of housing they need. The only way to do it is with public-private partnerships. There was some major studies done in the United States about different jurisdictions and which ones were most successful in doing it. And the only ones that were, according to the studies that I read, were those that gave land or money to public-private partnerships as an inducement for them to produce a certain amount of affordable housing. I think that's the way to do it. Get developers to build a development and say 10 or 20% of that should be affordable. And I'm going to therefore give you a low interest rate loan, or I'm going to give you a grant, or I'm going to give you some free land, or maybe it's land at a discount. That's the way that we build affordable housing, by letting the private sector do it, but having the public sector involved in a public-private partnership. I also believe in inclusionary zoning, and that might be controversial for some. I think that the bill did an analysis of 18 different municipalities around North America that instituted inclusionary zoning, and all of them, but 2, provided incentives to the developers to provide that inclusionary zoning, either with increased zoning, density, height, or decreased development fees or something of the like. Toronto and I think it was Portland were the only 2 municipalities in North America that just demanded the inclusionary zoning without a offsetting incentive. So I do think we need to give the incentives to the developers such that they don't lose money by putting in that inclusionary zoning. But I think if you provide that incentive and increased height, increased density, lower development fees or something like that, and demand in return a certain percentage of inclusionary zoning, the developers will do that. It's the right thing to do. Makes economic sense. They will be motivated by the profit. And I think that we've learned, and I'd like to take some last name credit for it. Crombie Park, downtown Toronto, was one of the first mixed income developments, and it works. Mixed income developments work. Having ghettos that are only for the poor, for social housing, I don't think work. And so I think that inclusionary zoning with 10 or 20% or something like that of affordable housing is the right way to go. Mixed income housing is the way to go. And I do think we need social housing. We need housing for refugees. We need housing for people that have got mental health issues. We need housing for poor people that aren't going to be able to afford housing. And we don't want to have a community, as some people have called it the Manhattanization of Toronto. We want to have all incomes, all people in Toronto, in the Greater Toronto area, in other urban areas around Ontario. And I think that we need to build social housing. The only way, though, that you're going to build social housing is if the public sector gives land or grants or low interest loans or something like that as a incentive to developers to provide that social housing. Or alternatively, the city governments are going to have to do it themselves, and I'm not sure they do a great job at that. We're going to take a break for some messages. I'm going to come back with my next 8 crises that I think need to be addressed. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Sagan on 60. I wanted to address a 10-point plan that I think would be a good platform for a political party. It doesn't have to be the Liberal Party, but as people are thinking about casting their vote, and I'm not going to in any way, shape, or form suggest how people should vote, but I want to talk about some of the issues that I think are critically important. And I started with, we need a vision for the Greater Toronto Area and for Ontario, and I'm not sure that any of the political parties or the leaders have been actually talking about their vision for what Toronto could and should be, and the Greater Toronto Area could and should be, and Ontario could and should be. And I think that's critically important. I also talked about the housing crisis and the affordability crisis, which I think is the biggest issue of our generation, because we're leaving our kids with the reality that they can't afford the single family home dream. They can't afford a condo that's more than 700 square feet, unless they go to somewhere that's 45 minutes or an hour from where their work is. I think that's wrong. And I think this is primarily at the fault of local government, and we need to address it. But the next crisis that I think we have is a congestion crisis, and therefore the need for dramatic improvements in transit. I don't think we're going to be able to do it with roadways. Back in the 1950s, there was this proposal to have, I think it was 5 or 6 expressways going into downtown Toronto. In addition to the Don Valley Parkway and the Gardiner, there was a Scarborough expressway proposed. There was the Spadina Expressway proposed, and there was the Black Creek, the extension of the 400 proposed. So 3 other expressways to go into downtown Toronto on top of the 2 that we have. But we don't have that. And I think that's the right decision. And we've got a livable downtown because of that. And we've got less parking downtown because of that. Houston, which is a city I've done business in, has 40 lanes of freeway traffic going into downtown Houston. Toronto has 12. Actually, I think that's in and out. I guess we've only got 6 going in. So we've dramatically reduced the amount of freeway lanes that access downtown Toronto. And I think that was probably a very smart decision. David Crombie, distant relative, was probably key in that, in stopping, along with Bill Davis, the Spadina Expressway. But we haven't done the job that we need to do in transit. And we know that. And this Ontario line that the provincial government is currently building is a downtown relief line. It makes a ton of sense, but it only solves sort of the congestion at Bloor and Yonge, and gives, an opportunity for people that are up at Don Mills and Eglinton, Laird, etc., as a way to get downtown and the other places on the line. But I think we've got a whole region that desperately needs transit. I think the Eglinton Crosstown is a huge debacle. I'm not sure why it's taking so long and why we don't have an opening date as of yet. And I do think the Eglinton Crosstown should go to the airport and to the airport corporate zone. The airport corporate zone, which is that big corporate and industrial area around the airport, is the second largest economic activity zone in all of Canada after the downtown Toronto area. It's the second largest, bigger than downtown Vancouver, downtown Calgary, etc. And it doesn't have transit, and it should. And it should be connected. And the Neptus Foundation did a major study a couple of years ago that said, major cities that have 2 economic zones that are profitable and successful have connectivity. And they use La Défense, which has got a subway going to the Champs-Élysées. They used, New Jersey and frankly Brooklyn, that's got subways going to Manhattan. They used areas of London, Canary Wharf, that's got this great connection to the city of London. And there's other examples of that. We should have transit connection between the airport corporate zone, the airport, and downtown Toronto. There's been 2 proposals on how to get there that I'm aware of. One would be taking the UP Express and circling it back down after it goes by Terminal 1 into the airport corporate zone, which I think makes a lot of sense, so that people can go both ways after they leave the airport, or having the Eglinton Crosstown go all the way to the airport corporate zone, and maybe both make sense and connect up with the Mississauga BRT. I think that that's critical. I also think that all day 2-way go, we've been talking about way too long, and we haven't taken action on it. And the most important line is the Milton Mississauga line, which has, according to the studies that I've seen, the highest benefit to cost ratio that traffic consultants, transit consultants had ever seen, is an 8-to-1 benefit to cost ratio, because there's so many people that are along that line. It runs on a diagonal through Mississauga and then all the way out to Milton, that could take it to get to jobs in other parts of Mississauga and Milton, as well as to Toronto and downtown Toronto. And there's only 6 or 7 trains downtown in the morning and 6 or 7 trains out in the evening. And if you think you're going to miss that last train, you don't stay late. Or you don't take the train and you drive. And I don't think that there's any transit opportunity that makes more sense than that. And when you think about it, it already exists. We just got to get the freight traffic off of that line. And there are solutions that have been proposed for that. And having the freight traffic, including oil and gas and dangerous goods, going straight through the center of Toronto, right by the Summerhill LCBO, through the annex, etc., I don't think makes a lot of sense. And so I think there's a solution to that, and we should implement it. But not just that line. I think the Barrie, the Richmond Hill, the Markham lines all should be all-day 2-way frequent GO train service. And I think that the line to Bolton should be looked at, if not, frankly, all the way to Orangeville. All unused rail lines should be looked at. I think there's a rail line that goes from Mississauga through Bloor West, right through the center of the city, between DuPont and Davenport, through by Casaloma, by the Summerhill LCBO, out to the Science Center, and on the way to Peterborough. You could have another sort of east-west line comparable to the Lakeshore line, cutting through the center of the city, going all the way from Peterborough to Cambridge, if you wanted. that I think makes a ton of sense. And maybe you don't do it all the way right away, but you could certainly do it through the center of the city, providing that connectivity across the city that I think we so desperately need. I think that we need connectivity in a circle, like London, England has, like New York has, where the subways connect up in Queens and in Brooklyn, so that you can go both ways. You don't always have to go down to Union Station and come back out again. And there's a couple of solutions that have been looked at that I think make a lot of sense. One would be connecting up whatever we build in Scarborough, the Scarborough subway, back to the Shepherd subway. The Shepherd subway is an incredibly expensive subway, not used that much. But if we took it across Shepherd or across the 401, and connected it up with the Scarborough subway so that people could go both ways, I think that makes a ton of sense. I think that connecting up north-south somewhere in the West End makes a lot of sense. There is a railway right-of-way owned by Metrolinx that goes from Long Branch up to Kipling. I think that connectivity makes sense. And you could even extend it either up to 427 or along a hydro line all the way to the airport, such that if you were in Oakville or Mississauga and you wanted to go to the airport, you didn't have to go all the way downtown to catch the UP Express. You could go to Long Branch, switch to another train or subway or BRT or whatever that would take you, or a monorail maybe, that would take you to Kipling and then on to the airport. The bus line that is from what I understand, the highest traffic bus line is the Kipling Red Rocket that goes from Kipling to the airport. Why don't we provide transit? The SkyTrain in JFK that goes from Jamaica Station to JFK is incredibly well used, incredibly convenient, and it travels in a elevated LRT like the Canadian line, the Canada line in Vancouver, right down the middle of the Van Nuys Expressway, which would be comparable to the 427. And I've used it tons of times when I go to New York, and Jamaica Station is sort of like Kipling because it's the intersection of rail, like the GO train, Long Island Railway in Jamaica Station's example, and the subway, like the TTC. And so I think that makes a ton of sense. And then all of a sudden that Kipling Station would become sort of like Union Station Southwest, if Union Station West was at the airport. And so I think that makes a ton of sense. So east-west connection through the center of the city, and north-south connection in Scarborough potentially, and in Etobicoke potentially. And frankly, the Huron-Ontario LRT provides some of that connectivity, but it just dead ends, which is a mistake, and it should connect there as well to something like into the airport. I also think that high-speed rail to Montreal is something we've been dreaming about and talking about forever. I do think that we have an economic opportunity of combining Quebec and Montreal with Toronto and Ontario in a far greater amount. I used to work in Boston and New York, and Amtrak between Boston and New York, when you go from the center of the city to the center of the city and on to Washington, is the way that a lot of business people, a lot of tourist people travel. It's convenient. It's fast. It's not as fast as an airplane, but it's pretty damn fast. It's pretty convenient, and it makes a lot of sense. And I think carbon footprint is a lot lower. And so we got to get off our backsides and do something with high-speed rail. I worry that there's been too much focus on 413. I do think we need some connectivity. I'm not sure 413 is the right solution. I wonder if buying the 407 and or somehow making the 407 more economic to take some of the congestion off the 401 is the right thing to do. I travel on the 401 every day, twice a day, and it's a disaster. And anyone that travels on the 401 knows how bad it is. And we desperately need some sort of a solution. But if we do the 413, it should be connected to the Bradford bypass and then go on in the east. And it shouldn't be on farmland if at all possible. And it shouldn't be in the Greenbelt if at all possible. I think it should be on as much as possible on land that is not pristine agricultural land. And I got to believe that the routing could be done to solve that. But I also think that the 407 is a better solution if we've only figured out how to do it. I do think that building 4-lane highways, though, are critical. And when I think about the interstate highway system in the United States, and the gutsy people that built the McDonald Cartier 401 back in, when it was at the 50s or the 60s, that kind of vision we need. the 407 should go all the way to Ottawa. We should not have the nation's capital that doesn't have a 4-lane highway going straight to it. And I think that would open up a lot of economic opportunities in Eastern Ontario if we had a 407 that continued on past where it terminates at 115 and goes all the way to Ottawa. I also think that there should be another 4-lane highway that goes up north, maybe to Collingwood or Owen Sound. There's too much congestion on the 400. And I think if we had a highway that went to Collingwood or Owen Sound or the Bruce Peninsula up in the northwestern portion of Southern Ontario, we would have, again, economic development, tourism development, and probably therefore it's the extension of the 410. And I think those two actually probably make more sense than another ring road around Toronto with the 413. I also think that we've got a huge opportunity with buses. Toronto has been written up around the world as one of those cities that has great bus connectivity to the subway system. And we shouldn't drop that and lose that opportunity. And we should make sure that everyone in the Greater Toronto Area has an opportunity to grab a bus and get to a subway. I think that the last mile problem has been talked about, and Uber or Lyft or bicycles are some solutions, but the most economic and the best way to do it in high traffic areas is buses. We've got a great bus system and we should be proud of it and we should invest in it. I think we also have a debt deficit crisis. And I think there's a couple of solutions to that. In the debt deficit crisis that we have in cities, I think 1% of the GST, HST should go to cities. And I think that they should therefore have the opportunity to pay for the infrastructure and pay for the costs that they've got. The vast majority of infrastructure in Ontario and Canada is owned by cities, and they've got the smallest taxing authority. We need to upload the DVP and the Gardner from the City of Toronto to the provincial government, where it should be. Why we've got 4-lane highways that are used by lots of different people in the Greater Toronto Area are owned by the City of Toronto, and it ends up being one of the biggest budget items in the City of Toronto budget. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. I think we need to have an attitude toward deficit and debt that we don't need to balance the books per se, because I don't think a lot of companies will ever get rid of all of their debt. And so therefore, people that say, no, companies will, get rid of all their debt and have a surplus, that's not true. If you're growing, you're going to have, debt all the time. But what companies ensure is that their debt service coverage ratio stays strong and hopefully gets healthier over time. And the comparable would be in a government, their debt to GDP or their debt to provincial GDP. And that, I think, should always be declining. You should have an attitude that it's always going down as a proportion of the GDP. And there's two ways you can do that. And you should be doing both at the same time. One is decrease the debt, but the other is increase the GDP. And so therefore we should have a growth mindset and orient ourselves to growing the pie, to pay the interest bill, to pay the deficits, but also to provide the prosperity for the future. I do think that one of the challenges we've got is a massive amount of red tape, and we've got to cut red tape. And I think that should be a real effort of any government anywhere, but particularly in Ontario. And I think the last and most important thing in regards to the debt and deficit is to grow the economy. I think that as I've looked at the problems that we've got in Canada, the problems that we got in Ontario, we've got a cost problem, and it's red tape primarily and bureaucracy, and we should be reducing it. But the biggest problem we've got is that our productivity is half of what the United States is. And so that leads to my next crisis, the productivity and prosperity crisis, which I think desperately needs to be addressed. 2 decades ago, we had the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity that I think came out with a bunch of really good and interesting recommendations. And they talked about how to get goods, people, and ideas moving again, and getting ideas moving again, I think is so critical. I don't think that we have that kind of productivity, prosperity, attitude, vision, policies in Ontario and the Greater Toronto Area to the extent that we could and should, and that we need to if we're going to grow. And to have a productivity growth that is half of what it is in the United States, that's declining, that's taking us from, I think, we're not part of the G7 anymore. We're like G18 or something like that. It's wrong. And we need to do something aggressive in that regard. And I don't think that is necessarily governments giving big, huge amounts of money and grants to Korean or other plants that are going to come in and employ a whole bunch of foreigners that are going to come in. That's not the way to actually create prosperity? I think it's to get all of us not investing in 6 condos, pre-construction condos, which has been too much of what a whole bunch of people have been doing over the course of the last decade or so, with low interest rates and this unbelievable increase in housing. And numerous commentators have said this, that the housing bubble really took a whole bunch of money out of the productive economy. And I think that's a problem that needs to be addressed as well. But how do you get the incentives to people to invest in productive parts of the economy, in high tech, in green tech, in biotech, in pharmaceuticals, in industry, et cetera? I think that small and medium sized businesses are the growth engine of our economies. And how do you get to do that? Well, I do think that it's not government deciding who's the winner, but it is government giving incentives to sectors, and or frankly, all industry. And I think one of the biggest issues is something like flow-through shares, as an example. I think that flow-through shares that exist for mining companies should exist for oil and gas companies, should exist for high-tech, biotech, pharmaceutical companies. I don't understand why we have flow-through shares, which give developers, explorers, a after-tax benefit from an investment standpoint, and not in other sectors of society. And what we do is replace it with big, they're called SHREDs, scientific and research grants and deductions, but they're bureaucratic, they're red tape, they take a long time to get, et cetera. If we just had the ability to have flow-through shares for all productive segments, if not all investments, I think it would make a ton of sense. And when you think about flow-through shares, you're not taking money out of the public purse. All you're doing is accelerating when you get to take that deduction, which gives a lower risk to the investor and a higher probability of success. But the government's going to get the same amount of money in absolute dollars. It's just going to take longer to get there. And so I think it's one of the smartest ways of structuring an incentive to get people to invest in more productive parts of the economy. I do think that collaboration, cooperation, connection between downtown Toronto, Waterloo, the airport corporate zone, so people can meet and come up with great ideas, is critical, because I do think that ecosystem that is talked about so often has grown barnacles during COVID and with congestion, and we need to get that back. So I think we need to address a productivity and prosperity crisis. We need to match, if not exceed, the United States in productivity growth. And that should be an embarrassment to every politician in Canada and in Ontario, that we have got productivity that is half of what it is in the United States. They're not that much smarter, that much better than us. We should be able to match them. And I think the connection to that, which is less about Toronto and more about the balance of Ontario, is a critical mineral strategy and development of the Ring of Fire. We have been talking about development of the Ring of Fire for what, 20 years? And I don't know if we've done that much about it. And I think the issue here, again, is government red tape, but this time it's the federal government to provincial government, maybe not as much municipal as it is in housing crisis. We need to speed approvals. We need to ensure certainty. We need to keep our environmental reviews and make sure things are environmentally compatible with our environmental goals. But we need to do those reviews more quickly so that business people that want to make the investments have certainty about what's going to happen, and don't think that they're going to wait 8 years to go through an environmental review process and not know whether in the end they're going to be able to do a development. I think that the liquefied natural gas developments in Australia that have been talked about, that have been developed in no time flat, when we've talked about not being able to do it in Atlantic Canada and service our customers in Europe, should be an embarrassment to our country. And I do think, therefore, we need to think about pipelines and hydro wires and roads to the Ring of Fire and approvals of critical minerals that are going to be desperately needed. You think about batteries. We need lithium. You think about all the different things that we're going to do with electric cars. And I understand that IMF and the McDonald-Laurier Institute said that we need an 8 times increase in the mining of critical minerals. And those critical minerals are in China, Russia, and Canada. And uranium is in Saskatchewan and Ontario. And I think uranium and nuclear energy is one of the best ways to reduce carbon emissions and produce power. And so we need to really think about what we're going to do from a debt deficit standpoint, from a productivity and prosperity vision standpoint, and from exploitation development of our critical minerals and the Ring of Fire. We're going to take a break and come back with my last 4 issues. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've taken this opportunity with the Ontario Liberal leadership election this weekend to give you my platform. I'm not running, and I'm not going to be talking about any of the candidates that are running because, as I've mentioned, I'm feeling a little bit divorced from the situation, even though I've been a long-time supporter of the Liberal Party up until, frankly, the last election. And that said, I think I've got a point of view that I want to talk about. And so if any of you want to listen, fantastic. I appreciate that. Because I've given a lot of thought. I've had the opportunity to interview over 1,500 people for my show over the course of the last couple of years. I've been doing a doctorate in business a thesis on economic development and entrepreneurship. I've been chair of Transit Alliance, which is focused on transit. I was chair of the Mississauga Summit, which was a city summit that was oriented toward creating economic opportunities in Mississauga. And I've been involved in business for the last 40 years. And I've had the opportunity to work across the US and Canada. I've lived and worked in Vancouver, London, Toronto, Montreal, and I've lived and worked in Los Angeles, New York, and Boston. And in my current job, I have the privilege of traveling to Montreal, Ottawa, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC on a very regular basis. And so I think I've got a unique, actually, maybe it's not that unique, but a really good view. And I fear that too many people that, only live in Toronto or only live in Ontario and don't get to see the balance of the country. And frankly, I don't do enough in Atlantic Canada. And I'd really like to do that. And I've never been to the Northwest Territories, but I do get an opportunity to see Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Montreal, Ottawa on a very frequent basis. And I go to Windsor and small towns or smaller towns in Ontario on business. And so I get to interact with a lot of those people. I've talked about we need a vision for Toronto and Ontario. We need to address the housing crisis. We need to address our congestion crisis with new transit. We need to address our debt and deficit crisis. We've got to have a strategy for increased productivity and prosperity. And we've got to address critical minerals and the Ring of Fire. My last 4. We have a long-term care crisis. We are facing a coming tsunami of elderly people. The baby boomers are just turning 77 now, but the boom is coming. And we cannot house those people in institutional seniors' homes. There's just no way that we can build enough. The only solution is home care. And that's actually how the vast majority of people want to live out their life, is in their own home. And yet we haven't been doing a good job, I don't think, about thinking through long-term care. We don't pay the personal care workers and the nurses enough. We have this strange thing that gives a bigger subsidy to people that are not-for-profit companies rather than for-profit companies. And I don't think that's the right attitude. And we're not going to be able to build enough not-for-profits to develop enough long-term care people. We need to provide the incentive for private enterprise to get involved in providing this service. And we need good people, good nurses, good personal care people to come and take care of us so that we can live out our lives, which are longer lives now than they were in the past. And only a few of us are going to be in institutional care. The vast majority of us are going to be living at home, and we need that long-term care. So we need to dramatically improve our long-term care. We have a healthcare crisis. We all know that. It's a funding crisis. It's a wait time crisis. It's a wage crisis. It's a losing doctors and nurses to other jurisdiction crisis. And I don't know what the solution is. I really don't know. I do think that one of the solutions is more family doctors, such that we have really good family clinics and people are responsible for not just sick care, but healthcare. Because I think too much of our healthcare system is really sick care. We only take care of people when they get sick. And what we should be doing is more healthcare, where we try to keep people healthy. And I think it's the family doctors, the clinics, the local clinics that do that. And I think because we pay people too much in specialization or in hospitals and not enough in family physician clinics, and we don't give them enough support from a business management, marketing standpoint, et cetera, that we don't have enough family doctors. And there's people across this province that are looking for family doctors, and that's a mistake. And if we had more family doctors and more local clinics, people wouldn't go to the emergency room with a cold or to the hospital with whatever problem they are, and we'd free up some of those beds. And I think if we solve the long-term care problem, we won't have people that are clogging up beds. And after that, I think we have to think about a more sustainable funding system. I do think that the statistics are that something like 80% of our lifetime healthcare expenditures are expended in the last 18 or 24 months of life. So as the baby boomers age and they become health issues, they develop health issues, our healthcare expenditures are going to go up dramatically. And are we ready for that? We have pre-funded pensions, but we have not pre-funded healthcare. We have not pre-funded long-term care. We need to be seriously thinking about not only our current situation, but the situation in the future and how it could get worse. I think we have a governance crisis in Ontario, maybe in Canada. And I think that one solution is proportional representation. And this is why our turnout has gone down dramatically. It's like 28% in the last Toronto mayoralty election. It's below 40% in the last provincial election, because so many people don't think their vote counts for anything. If you're a Liberal voter in a rural part of Ontario, you know your candidate's not going to win. And if you're a Conservative voter in downtown Toronto, you know your candidate's not going to win. And so people don't bother going in. And frankly, in some places in rural, probably the Conservative doesn't go up because they know that there's a whole bunch of other Conservatives that are going to vote 60% in favor of the Conservatives, so their vote doesn't count. And similarly, unless there's a good fight between the NDP and the Liberals in a downtown riding, similarly, those people don't go out. Plus, people, because of, I think, our leader-oriented politics, don't really care about the local representative, even though that local representative, that local member of provincial parliament ends up being critically important. People just vote party and leader and don't pay attention locally. I think if we had representation by population, popular vote, we'd have a far better system. I don't think that you want to have every small little party that's like maybe less than 2% or 3% or 5% get party status and get seats, because you don't want to fragment the system too widely. But the fact that it took 6 Liberal votes to equal 1 NDP vote or something like that, and even more to equal a Conservative vote in the last election, is wrong. And if you had representation by population, proportional representation, I think that everyone would realize that one more Liberal vote in rural Ontario or one more Conservative vote in downtown Toronto, or an NDP vote wherever, or a vote for the none of the above party or whoever it is, would be a vote that would be cast, because it doesn't have to win by the first past the post system in your local riding. So I think that we should have a leader and a political party and a government that says we're going to have a referendum on proportional representation and should campaign in favor of that. Justin Trudeau, in the first election campaign, said this is the last election under first past the post, and nothing happened. And I think it needs to. I do think we're over-governed. If you take a look at some of our cities, we've got dramatic over-representation in ward councillors and mayors and chairs of regions, and then MPPs and MPs. And I do think that Doug Ford, when he reduced the number of MPPs in Toronto, actually it was city councillors, I apologize, was smart, and it was the right decision. And I think that probably we should think about a reduction of local councillors comparable to federal ridings and provincial ridings, elsewhere across the province. Someone told me that Niagara Region, for an example, has more politicians per capita than almost anywhere else in North America, because a region the size of one ward in Mississauga has got different councillors, different regional councillors, and different mayors, as well as a regional chair. And so, does that make sense? And I think we should be doing some rationalization of our governance and our number of politicians, because I think politicians, once they're elected, want to do good. And so they end up doing stuff. And maybe some of that stuff isn't necessarily all that helpful. And government sometimes gets in the way. I've become a little bit jaundiced over my life and am far more a supporter at times of Ronald Reagan's comment about government's the problem, not the solution. And I wish we could get back to the attitude that government was the solution. And I think a fewer politicians might be one of the ways to achieve that. And I do think that we've got fragmentation and balkanization in the Greater Toronto Area that doesn't make any logical sense. Anne Golden, a very bright person in the 1990s, did something called the GTA Task Force, and she recommended the amalgamation of the different boroughs of Toronto in the different cities of Toronto into one city, and that was implemented. And I don't think many people would go back. We have this historical appeal to the old Scarborough, Etobicoke, North York, etc. But I think most people see that the current city of Toronto actually makes a lot of sense, and I think the efficiency that was looked for has been received. But most people forget that Anne Golden actually at that time recommended something else. She recommended that similarly, Peel get amalgamated, Halton get amalgamated, Durham get amalgamated, and York get amalgamated. Frank Scarpitti, the mayor of Markham, recommended the amalgamation of York recently, and I regret to say was turned down very quickly by the premier. We've got, I think it's 24 cities around Toronto and 4 regions, so 29 mayors and chairs that would attend a mayor and chair regional meeting, along with one mayor from Toronto. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. That's not the right way to govern it. I do think there potentially is some places in these regions that are at the outskirts, like Caledon, for example, that might not make sense to amalgamate and aren't that urban, and so therefore could logically be separated out from, for example, Peel, and merge in with the regional municipality that is to the north of them. But Brampton and Mississauga merged would be 1.5 million people, 1.3 million people. It would be the third largest city in Canada. It would be a great city with the 403 and the 410 sort of bisecting it, and the 401. I think a lot of people in North Mississauga, the newcomers to Mississauga, don't even know where the Mississauga-Brampton border is, and they go back and forth over that border on a fairly regular basis. And it's only sort of the old timers that want Mississauga to stay separate, but those are the same old timers that wanted Port Credit, Streetsville, Cooksville, etc., to stay separate when they were all amalgamated to create Mississauga. And Mississauga makes a lot more sense today than having all those old towns that used to be here. And if we amalgamated Markham, Vaughan, Richmond Hill, Aurora, Newmarket, etc., and Ajax, Pickering, Oshawa, in Durham, and Oakville, Burlington, Milton into one cities, and then those 4 cities along with the mayor of Toronto. So 4 mayors of the major cities that are all would be about 1 million people or more, sat down with the mayor of Toronto, and there are only 5 of them. That's the kind of governance that works and can plan transit and can plan economic development activities and can plan sewage and hydro and all those other things. And I was told by one person that it'll never happen, because actually it was Hazel McCallion, the former mayor of Mississauga, that told me that it's the right thing to do, but no one got the political gumption to actually recommend it, because too many old timers will say, no, we need the small old towns of the past. But it was, she thought, the unbelievably right thing to do. I think it's something that we should be thinking about. And I'm not sure if you elect a chair like the old Metro Council chair, because I worry that that person might be even more powerful politically than the Premier of Ontario or the Minister of Municipal Affairs. But maybe the Premier or the Minister of Municipal Affairs is the chair of that regional GTA council of the 5 mayors of Peel, Halton, Durham, York, and Toronto. And I think if you take a look at the way that New York City is governed, the way that major cities around the world are governed, amalgamation, coordination, collaboration, connection are the right ways to think about it. And it may be radical and lots of people aren't going to like it, but I think it's the future, and I think that we need people who've got the vision to do it. We're going to take a break, and I'm going to come back with my final crisis. in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've been talking tonight about a platform that I would like to see from a political leader in Ontario about what needs to happen in Ontario. And I've spoken, and I'm, as I've said earlier, I'm not going to be commenting on any of the leadership candidates or how people should vote. But I wanted to talk, since I've got this platform with my radio show, about some of the policies that I think are critically important. And I number one, we need a vision for Toronto and Ontario that's consistent with this reality that Toronto is now the third largest metropolitan region in all of North America. Actually, it's not. It's the fourth after Mexico City. I keep leaving out Mexico City. So Mexico City, New York, Los Angeles, and then Toronto. And think about that. We've got this big metropolitan area that goes from Oshawa to Kitchener-Waterloo and to Niagara. We've got the second largest stock exchange. We've got the second or third largest concentration of financial services companies, banks, etc. We've got auto industry. We've got economic growth opportunities in medical, in high tech. I don't think we've got this attitude about how important we are and how we could become far more important in the future. And we are this economic engine, and we need to have people who've got a vision for what we're going to do with this economic engine to make sure that it's running on all cylinders. We have a housing crisis, affordability crisis that is the crisis of our generation, and we need to make sure that we solve it. Otherwise, our kids are going to lose the Canadian dream of having a house of their own. We have a congestion crisis that we need to address with dramatic improvements in transit and investment in transit. We have a debt and deficit crisis that we need to address with good fiscal, sane management. We have a productivity and prosperity crisis where our productivity is something like, at least our productivity growth is something like 50% of it is in the United States. And we need to do something desperately about that so that we have the lifestyle, we have the prosperity, number one, that we want, and number two, such that we can fund all of these other issues that we've got, particularly the age of our society, which is going to lead to the long-term care crisis and the healthcare crisis that we've got. I think in addition to the prosperity agenda we need to have an agenda on critical minerals and the Ring of Fire. I talked about a governance crisis that we've got, which leads to my final one, which I think is really important. And that is, I worry that we've lost our identity of a unified Canada, a federal Canada. We end up being too often Ontarians and Albertans and Quebecers, and we're losing that I am Canadian kind of attitude. And I think I've seen this in a couple of things. I think it's in the use of the notwithstanding clause, which, when I thought, and I did an essay in college about this, the notwithstanding clause should be those things that you're embarrassed to use, that you never use. It's one of those things that is there as a safety valve in an emergency, but you never, ever want to use it because you never want to admit that you're actually doing something in contravention of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that you're not infringing people's human rights, Canadian rights. And so I think that this attitude that too many premiers have had, too many governments have had, that we can, willy-nilly, make use of the notwithstanding clause so we don't have to have our laws abide by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is just wrong. And we should change it. I think that, this commission that came after the Emergency Measures Act that said that, there really was not a lot of consultation and collaboration between Ontario and the federal government should be shocking and a shame to people. Our governments should work together. They shouldn't be having political infights, particularly in times of pandemics and or emergency crises, whether you think that it's an emergency measures crisis or just an emergency. We should be working together. I also think that too often we're thinking about only ourselves, and whether it's oil and gas or whether it's separate pension funds or whether it's auto industry or whether it's, my comments about Ontario and Toronto being so important, we've got to think about Canada. And I think that the Premier of Ontario in the past has been one of those people that have stood up for Canada. And I'm not sure we're doing that anymore, and to the extent that we need to. And some of the ways that could happen is that we could have a Premier of Ontario that supports the Alberta oil and gas business or the Saskatchewan uranium business or the liquefied natural gas business in British Columbia, that uses their political capital and their podium to argue in favor of things that benefit all of Canada. I think that this proposal that we didn't get for liquefied natural gas in Atlantic Canada, because we had people that didn't support a pipeline, when I think most people think that pipelines are a heck of a lot better than buying liquefied natural gas or oil and gas from Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or Russia or wherever, and or shipping some of that stuff by rail. The pipelines are pretty damn safe, and we could have done it. We need to have those kinds of things. I think that the railways and the Trans-Canada Highway knit Canada together. I wonder in the future whether the things that knit Canada together are high-speed rail, pipelines, hydro wires, things like that. I think that we need to regain a Canadian identity. And I think the Premier of Ontario needs to be part of that. I think bilingualism is critically important. I think close relations with other premiers are important. I think that working together with the federal government is important. I think that being proud of Canada and who we are is critically important. I think that in the United States, you do see governors, and maybe too partisan at times, but you see governors being far more supportive of their federal leadership, albeit the federal leadership in a specific party, than you ever see in Canada. And I think that we need to knit our country back together again. And I really worry that we're falling apart. As I mentioned earlier on the show, I have the privilege in my job, my day job, to travel a fair amount between Montreal and Toronto and Ottawa and Windsor and Saskatchewan and Calgary and Edmonton and Vancouver and Victoria. And it's wonderful. And in prior jobs, I used to travel a lot in the United States and between Montreal and Toronto. But this is the first job I've had where I really travel a lot across all of Canada in business. Canada is a beautiful country, and the people across Canada are wonderful. And I went to Fort McMurray and saw how big those tractors are that are pulling out the oil sands. And I went to North Battleford, Saskatchewan, and saw the Indigenous bands that are working so closely together for economic development, and some of the planning issues in Victoria, and some of the economic opportunities, and the power of transit with the new elevated railway system in Montreal. We've got a beautiful country. We should knit it together. We should stand up for the country more. And the Premier of Ontario, the leadership in Ontario, should be some of the biggest, not just cheerleaders, but backbone for this great country that we call Canada. Anyway, thanks for listening. If any of you listened, I really appreciate the opportunity to give you my sense of what the policy platform could and should be. I'll repeat it real quick. A vision for Toronto and Ontario. Address the housing crisis. Address the congestion crisis and our need for transit. Address the debt and deficit crisis, the productivity and prosperity crisis, critical minerals and the Ring of Fire, long-term care crisis, healthcare crisis, a governance crisis, and a federal Canada crisis. Thanks for listening. That's my show for tonight. I remind you I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, and all my podcasts and videocasts are available on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night.